Started. It's 12:01. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the second installment of the Workshop in Cultural Affairs for Spring 2024. I say spring, sort of feels like spring outside, but I guess it technically is still February. Very excited to have our speakers today. First, I'm Johanna. I'm one of the faculty directors here at Center for Cultural Affairs. Excited to have our speakers, Professor Andrew Zitcer and Professor Johanna Taylor. Unfortunately, Johanna could not be with us today, but Andrew will be presenting on her behalf. Andrew is a professor at Drexel University and Johanna is a professor at Arizona State, and they'll be presenting on their work on creative placemaking in transition, a look back and a look forward. And I believe some of this work has been published in the GIA Reader, if I saw correctly, and you've been also presenting in other forums. So I'm excited to hear about it today because I haven't had an opportunity to dig in. So today will be my day. So thanks, Andrew, and take it over.
Thanks so much for having me, Johanna, and thanks to everybody at Indiana for making a hospitable online home for this presentation. First off, I just want to say apologies on behalf of Johanna. She had a medical issue that presented itself this morning, and she had to go to get it taken care of. And so we're sending her our warm wishes and our thoughts as she deals with that. And I'm sure I will connect with her later today, find out how she's doing, and also, let her know how the presentation went. The second thing I'll say is that, if you have any really hard questions that I can't answer, it's because Johanna knows the answers. So I'll just use her as a convenient foil for that, since she's not able to be with us today. And then the third thing I'll say is that this is work that we put out in the GIA Reader based on empirical work that we did over the last couple of years, but this is the next iteration of it. This is the part that's going to include the theorizing that we want to do for a future article. And we're hoping to use this really as a workshop to discuss with you what we have inductively kind of arrived at and get feedback from some of the great minds that are in this room now about how to take the work forward. So this is kind of new virgin territory for us. We're very excited about it. And I will share my screen and start my presentation. And we're looking forward to everyone's questions. I'm gonna present for probably half the time and then hopefully have half the time for Q&A. So let us begin. I'm gonna go into the slideshow. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, let us begin with a look back, a look forward, creative placemaking in transition. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Andrew Zitcer. I'm an associate professor in the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University, where I run the Urban Strategy Master's Program, which is a small interdisciplinary master's program in urban affairs. And I also teach in the Arts Administration and Museum Leadership Program, where I got my start. I've been at Drexel for a little over a decade, and I'm really pleased to be here with you this morning. So to give you just an overview of the presentation today, we're going to begin with the research questions and the methodology or research approach. Then I'll discuss the literature. I'll give a quick overview of creative placemaking for those of you who aren't familiar with it, though I know most of the people in this room are familiar with it, so I'll keep that brief. Then we'll move into our findings and analysis, and really our questions around what transitions are occurring within the field of creative placemaking, what has taken place since 2019 and 2020, and what is the future of creative placemaking. And we'll end with policy and program recommendations and opportunities for future work. So here are the questions that kind of animated our inquiry, if you will. How do the people who have shaped creative placemaking see the field defined and bounded? What does it mean to them now in 2023, 2024? What has led us to this place? What have been the changes to creative placemaking since 2020? What is the future of creative placemaking? And this is the key question. Is it a field or a collection of disparate initiatives? Has it morphed and changed into something else? And then the last provocative question is, are we witnessing the end of, quote, creative placemaking as a coherent set of practices? Is this work a eulogy for creative placemaking? Is this sort of, are we moving into a new era? So I'll give a quick overview of creative placemaking, even though I know many of you are familiar with it. It's a core strategy of US cultural policy and practice. There are many different definitions, but this one, conveniently published by Zitcer et al., says that creative placemaking are place-based interventions fostering community development with art centrally located in the process. And we can talk about what definitions to use. We can also talk about what words to use to talk about this phenomenon. This creative placemaking era began arguably with a white paper commissioned by the NEA by Ann Markuson and Ann Gadwin Nicodemus in 2010, though the practices of creative placemaking go back much further in time, and the sort of notion of placemaking itself as a concept goes back to this, arguably the City Beautiful movement or indigenous practices. You can take it as far back as you would like. At the same time, around the Our Town grant was started by the NEA around that same time as the white paper came out. And then there was a simultaneous launch through the entrepreneurial efforts of the NEA of Art Place America, which is a consortium of funders that supported art, creative placemaking from 2010 to 2020. And then there have been other foundations that have invested significant additional dollars, like Kresge, William Penn, Cerna Foundation, and others. And between 2010 and 2020, at least $200 million has been invested in creative placemaking, probably more. And the practice has spread to other agencies and philanthropic actors since that time. So Johanna and I wanted to understand how creative placemaking has changed in the last 3 or 4 years. And so we did 21 individuals interviews, semi-structured interviews with people who were part of an earlier report, which I'll talk about in a second, called Financing Creative Placemaking. And then we moved on to the funders of the original report that came out in 2020, and a snowball sampled from there. We made 2 strategic choices. One was that we wanted to follow the people who were active in creative placemaking rather than following the institutions. So rather than talking to the head of the EPA, we talked to somebody at the EPA, for example, something like that, who was who may have been somewhere else. So there's a lot of former Art Place, former this, former that, folks who've moved on to other institutions, but we wanted to talk to the people who were active during the core years of creative placemaking. And then the second choice was, we, as a matter of dealing with our IRB and confidentiality, we requested to use people's real names and affiliations because we wanted to tell this sort of like oral history of creative placemaking with the real people and their affiliations. So people were very eager to participate and be identified in this study for the most part. So I mentioned that this new study grew out of a former study, which was called Financing Creative Placemaking, Analyzing Data and Trends for a Field in Transition. And that is a very data-heavy quantitative report for the most part. If you want to see a copy of it, it's available online, and you can scan the QR code that's on my screen now to be directed to the webpage. This project was done, I was a co-author on this, and it was commissioned by Art Place and the Kresge Foundation, with data also supplied by the NEA. It was done through the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation at Drexel University. We analyzed 573 projects that were funded by one of those 3 entities between 2012 and 2019. And we also did 16 qualitative case studies that we arrived at in deliberation and discussion with the folks at those entities. And we were looking for trends in the funding streams of creative placemaking. As Art Place America was about to sunset in 2020, we wanted to look at how financing of creative placemaking was done to kind of give the field some direction about how things might go after the time that Art Place was available. So what we learned from this Financing Creative Placemaking report was that the primary award, that would be the Our Town grant or the Art Place grant or the Kresge grant, was the largest single funding source in most capital stacks. It averaged 37% of the overall project budget. And then we found that these projects typically utilized funding from 5 to 7 additional sources. So creative placemaking projects at scale are complex entities, like a lot of community development. They have many different sources and uses. So other sources, including federal, state, anchor institutions, CDFIs, et cetera, were found to be critical to the success of funding creative placemaking projects. We learned that the grantees themselves contributed a lot to the projects, whether it was in kind or in cash, and that cross-sector collaborations matter. And then they've continued to matter. So this is just a list of everyone we spoke to, so we can give you just a minute to look over. I'm not going to read the names, but you can see it's a who's who of folks, including some folks who I think are on this call, who supported us in this research effort. A lot of folks who were at Art Place, a lot of folks in practice as artists, consultants, funders, and big thinkers, amazing people all. So now I want to talk about the emergent part of this research. We'll go back into the findings from the interviews, but I want to sort of situate this in the literature and to note that Johanna and I sort of arrived here inductively. We are interested in talking about the notion of creative placemaking as a field. And so we turned ourselves to the organizational fields and institutional sociology literature. But we didn't set out to study this originally when we started conducting the interviews. We just thought we'll update this 2020 report for 2024. And now that we've got some of that data under our fingertips, we starting to think about, what literature does this invoke? What questions in theory does this really call into being and call into question? So I'm going to speak a little bit on this slide for some time. And just to say that we are using this as a menu, a range of big ideas that we're engaging and unifying as we build a comprehensive theory for a future paper that we hope to submit to a journal this summer. So overall, we're drawing on Bourdieu and the notion of fields as relational spaces. We're interested in DiMaggio and Powell's definition of an organizational field as a recognized area of institutional life that connects all organizations and groups around a broader topic or discipline rather than basing it on organizational type. From Wooten and Hoffman, we learn that fields form around issues that unite the interests of organizations, and that issues define what the field is, drawing linkages that may not have been previously present. And from a question of creative placemaking, I think that's really germane. These before 2010, before the sort of like magic calling into being of something called creative placemaking, there were disparate actors, funders, government entities, practitioners, etc., who were doing things like creative placemaking or things you could call creative placemaking, but they weren't necessarily organized into a defined field. And we want to examine that question of power and agency in setting up organizational fields. From a Bourdieu perspective, fields cannot be analyzed separately from the notion of capital and capitals. So when we think about, whether it be social capital, symbolic capital, financial capital, all the different elements in that constellation, Bourdieu says you have to analyze that in connection with the notion of field. And then finally, the sort of trifecta of that is talking about habitus and habits of behavior, mind, and socialization as part of an organizational analysis. We go on to say that fields cannot be understood in isolation. They are relational and are driven by attempts to gain power and influence. And the boundaries of a field extend as far as power relations among those framing it allow. And the boundaries of organizational fields are always in flux, as we see. So then we looked at institutional entrepreneurship as a literature, which we're sort of playing with. And institutional entrepreneurs are reshaping internal systems they navigate daily and will remain involved in after these changes. Institutional entrepreneurs are also starting new institutions. Institutional change requires negotiation between the familiar and the unfamiliar, and the ability to strategically engage others in collective action. With entrepreneurship, there's this paradox of embedded agency. Institutions are the products of human agency, yet they also constrain human agency. So a person both moves within the institutional space to affect its operations, and they are also personally affected by the operations of the institutional space. And Badalana says that there are three interrelated levels of analysis that we need to attune to: the individual, the societal, and the organizational. So there's a tension around power in making institutional change possible. Often actors and struggles that are more peripheral and do not have insider status or access to make the change have a lot to gain from those changes. So agency and power are key themes in this literature. And we come back to thinking about the entrepreneurship of the various actors in the constellation of creative placemaking that help to shape the policy sort of environment that governs the way creative placemaking rolls out. The third bucket of literature, which we're exploring for our menu here, our sort of takeout menu of theory here, is the notion of sense making and narrative. So sense making came up in our interviews and emerged as one of the critical functions of specifically ArtPlace, really, that they did a lot of the sense making for the field. And sense making is often associated with the work of Carl Weick, tied closely to narrative interpretation, voice, and agency. He highlights sense making as an ongoing social retrospective activity about identity. And Barbara Czarniewska talks about organizational fields as dramas of institutional identity. So in the field, she asserts that narratives are produced. You do not have to consume ready-made ones that are made public after careful consideration, but narratives emerge, and there's a lot of sense-making activity that goes on to sort of sort in organizational narratives. And finally, Dvora Yano explains that interpretive methods of policy analysis, quote, are based on the supposition that we live in a social world characterized by the possibility of multiple interpretations. And she says we need to attend to feelings, values, and beliefs in the interpretive work of understanding policy. So in terms of creative placemaking, this is why we seek to lift up the voices of practitioners in this work in order to empower them as an interpretive community and a sense-making body or bodies in creative placemaking. Finally, we would be remiss if we didn't look at the literature specifically about cultural policy, arts, and planning and placemaking as a part of our literature. The arts and some extent the planning and policy literature have explored creative placemaking and arts and cultural policy. Some of this work explicitly calls out creative placemaking, and some looks at cultural policy and planning more broadly. So Carolyn Lowe and Amanda Ashley have found that creative placemaking has been adopted in municipal arts and culture plans, while understanding what it takes to comprehensively implement creative placemaking is still incomplete in those plans. Eleonora Radelli explores creative placemaking as a multi-level governance process in the US that's been implemented through research, grants, and partnerships. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And Alexis Frass and her opportunity scan of support vehicles for artists doesn't specifically call out creative placemaking, but does mention a number of the tools that we will discuss later in this presentation, like universal basic income and mutual aid, which are newer iterations of what has been called creative placemaking. So that was a lot. I'll take a deep breath and take a step back from all of that literature for a moment, and talk about why we're interested in this notion of a field. In 2018 through 2020, ArtPlace engaged in its own questioning of how creative placemaking functioned as a field. They commissioned, in partnership with ASU, Kresge, and the NEA, a study from the Bridgespan group on the strength of the creative placemaking field. And for them, the definition of a field was a critical mass of organization and individuals aligned and working effectively. They found that there was a shared identity among a group of practitioners that would not have previously seen their work as connected in a field of practice. ArtPlace was able to point to funder and policymaker engagement, adding to the standards of practice and to a knowledge base. But they found that there was still work to be done, including continuing the conversation about the meaning of the work to the field, particularly around developing equitable, healthy, and sustainable communities. So they found that there needed to be more partnerships between arts and culture and community development, more funding and policy support. And then they went into a field visualization by 2020 that discovered through a series of field reports on different sectors, the ways arts and culture can support equitable community development, drawing on years worth of research that Jamie Hand and others put together on the cross-sectoral nature of creative placemaking. So this leads us to a question. Is what was true about the field in 2018 still true in 2024? Are people using the resources? Are funders and policymakers still attentive? Are new leaders being developed and positioned to do this cross-sectoral work? So when we look at our interview data, our 21 semi-structured interviews that we conducted, we found 5 central themes. And they are talking about the emerging of the time of creative placemaking and transition. And there are 5 things I want to highlight. So the first one is the lasting impact of art place. Adam Erickson said to us, I think the space of caring for a field of practice, I don't think that's currently occupied. And I think that's the vacuum that art place left. During its tenure, art place was seen as complex due to its initial focus on economic impact, but later became a centering neutral party, uniting diverse practitioners around communities. That was a thought that Regina Smith shared with us from Kresge. Its legacy today is that the work produced in its final years continues to define how practitioners do their work and how funders shape funding. And 2 examples of things going on in the field are, one, sort of a late initiative of Art Place called Local Controls, Local Fields, supported place-based assemblies to do democratic fund making, grant making, and trust-based philanthropy, where they were granted blocks of funding and then set up as deliberative bodies to engage in grantsmanship on their own terms. And then very differently from that, we have CP Communities, which used to be headed by Leo Vasquez, that is training practitioners and hosting regional convenings at the local and state levels. But again, going back to Adam's quote, the interviewees acknowledged the lack of a national grounding organization without Art Place to unite diverse professionals who found productive connection together in spite of inconsistent feelings about the term creative placemaking. So that's where I want to turn to next, the importance and limitations of language for building a field. The term creative placemaking has always been contested. Placekeeping and place knowing have been proposed as alternative. PA Creative Communities, where I live, uses placekeeping, as do others. I was just in 2 conversations yesterday where people spontaneously used the words placekeeping or said, I'm a placekeeper, without referencing placemaking or creative placemaking in their lexicon. And that was just coincidental in some of the other work I'm doing locally in Philadelphia. So maybe creative placemaking, according to Michael Road, is a kind of a bridge term for other words and concepts that are evolving and that existed before creative placemaking existed. Regina Smith said that the field is diffuse. And Michael Road again says that this uses the term civic imagination, which he calls the capacity of residents and leaders in a place to collaborate creatively on equitable futures. Now, we did find that our term still had some, albeit reluctant, defenders. We heard one story where at the federal level, they were giving presentations about creative placemaking to mayors and other officials. And there was a story about one mayor coming up to the speaker afterwards and saying, now that I know what it's called, I get it. Creative placemaking, it makes sense to me. So there are still people using the term and people saying that the term has a legacy and a track record and should help us move into the future. So it's just a good question to think about. Like, do you need to have a name for an organizational field for it to be a field? Or can it be a set of diffuse, disparate practices with many names? Now, we want to note that there's still a federal commitment to the creative placemaking agenda with unprecedented expenditures available. We learned about this through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And then most recently, just a couple weeks ago, Johanna was present at the Healing, Bridging, Thriving Summit, which celebrated a commitment to arts, culture, and design across agencies through infrastructure investments, and that the NEA is leading a cross-agency initiative to embed art processes and artists as health-focused interagency working groups. and that in 2024, the EPA is going to launch their first federal artist in residence program at 6 estuary sites. And of course, NEA's Our Town program, the flagship creative placemaking program, grant making program, continues. The program was revamped in 2023 to respond to national trends. It's encouraging a focus on transportation, health, water, and climate. And partners can now include local governments or any quasi-governmental agency, slightly easing those partnership restrictions that were part of the Our Town grant earlier to make the grant more available to more folks. The commitment to creative placemaking recognizes the traction for the concept among mayors and other civic leaders and sees a change as a backward step. And this notion that Eleanor Radeli talks about, which is that it's a multi-level governance strategy through grants, research, and partnerships, still seems true. There's still a lot of research going on in the creative placemaking space, and there's still a lot of partnerships happening. The state has always been a part of creative placemaking, and we have to ask what it means now to have the state changing what that looks like and the shifting private and philanthropic infrastructures influencing creative placemaking. The next theme that emerged out of our interviews is that new program models are emerging, such as artists in residence in government. These programs align artists and designers in non-art sectors within civic agencies. The first federal program embedding artists in residency is launching at EPA in 2024, which I just said. And the funding shifts recognize this. The support does not come from arts funders alone. We're seeing increases in grants from non-art sectors, including the Builders Foundation, Good Chaos, New Pluralists. These are some of the funders that came up in our interviews. And a focus on people, not institutions. That gathering people across expertise and communities is vital to build and sustain the field to achieve equitable, justice-oriented goals. And when we talked to folks who were doing this work today, we found that there was an underlying tension that some arts administrators in non-art spaces feel disconnected from each other, again, perhaps due to the lack of a central coordinating entity that brings people together for gatherings like the Art Place Summit. There is some sort of sense of feeling alone in this work by some of the folks that we talked to. Finally, there are expansive new models that are promoting equity and justice. And with this sort of demonstrated to us that creative placemaking work is happening in new ways by new groups. We see a focus on shifting power dynamics from institutional power to people power. That is brought to bear by what I mentioned before, the Local Controls, Local Fields project, which still persists in some small way. The Culture and Community Power Fund that was launched in 2023, which was called by one of our interviewees Art Place 4.0, and it's supported by BAR, Kresge, and the William Penn Foundation. Increased awareness among funders of embedding artists and non-artists and non-arts work. Yet the philanthropy still holds power in this organizational field in deciding what works moves forward. And the second shift is a focus on labor equity, this emphasis on what Mara Cuffey called safety net work. So we're seeing these universal basic income programs like Creatives Rebuild New York, California Creative Corps, Maniobra in Puerto Rico, Springboard in Minnesota, and others, and focus on artists' equity and artists' livelihoods for funding full-time positions for artists with healthcare, benefits, intellectual property rights, and the like. So these things may or may not be called creative placemaking, but we believe that the focus on equity, artist agency, and cross-sector collaboration sort of is a callback to some of the founding or cardinal values of creative placemaking. So as I begin to close, I want to highlight a few program and policy recommendations that Johanna and I derived from our interviews. The first is to empower an entity to organize the future of cross-sector field building and unify practitioners to share resources and navigate collaboration challenges. And this was brought up to us by a number of people who we interviewed, that there needs to be an entity to sort of organize and collate and unify the practitioners to work together, whether that's the NEA or another entity, a part-time, entity that is formed in the now. The second finding is that we should support federal incentives for embedding the arts and artists across sectors, such as HUD, CDFI grants, community development block grants, etc. Next is to continue the experimentation with funding models that promote community power, such as enterprise-level investing and trust-based participatory philanthropy. Next, of course, we should value artists' labor through universal basic income programs, equity benefits, and protections of intellectual property. We should educate artists and community developers about the power of artist-centered, equitable community development. And that was a big thing that Michael Rowe talked about, was this notion of education as a key to the future of whatever we call creative placemaking. And then finally, fund racial justice and solidarity economy work. This work is critical for the future of our democracy, as Tom Borup and I have been thinking a lot about recently. This notion that democracy is founded upon a foundation of justice. So as I start to wrap us up, I'll talk about just this notion of tying connections back to that literature, that vast menu that I described on a slide a few slides back, and ask how the field, its actors and organizations, are defining itself. What is the state of the organizational field of creative placemaking? Does the Art Place Strong Fields framework still have any purchase? Is there power, especially philanthropic power, without a central organizing entity that is doing work that isn't just grant making? And a call from practitioners wanting a cultural policy agenda to arrive. Is there a role for multi-level governance in this? And then finally, questions of agency and institutional entrepreneurship. How do entrepreneurs shape the field of creative placemaking? So we wanted to end our presentation with more questions than we began with. So these are the questions that we wanted to offer to you as fodder for conversation. I'm sure you'll have many other questions, but we wanted to ask, is creative placemaking a defined field or a disparate set of practices in your view? Has it evolved into something else? What is the role of power, voice, and agency in defining a field? What is the role of the institutional entrepreneur? And do you have any suggestions of other literature to guide us or to help us sort of prune through our thicket of theoretical orbits? So we welcome your questions and feedback. Our contact information is at the bottom. And with that, it's just about 12:30, so I will stop my share and I will take your questions.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Please keep your questions coming. Either raise your hand or put them into the chat. As always, I will start. So I'm going to start with the recognition, Andrew, that you have achieved, I believe, maybe the highest number of participants in any workshop in our workshop series in the past 2 or 3 years. So if I do this, there you go. You get balloons.
Oh, that's incredible. I love that.
Yeah. So, but this is actually related to my comment because I'm wondering, looking at the participant list, there's a lot of people here who came from all of these different relevant areas to creative placemaking. I'm sure that we could probably list off all of the different industries, sectors, occupations, all these things. And it gets me back to thinking, and this was not on your final slide, but it was another aspect, I think, of the first question, which is like, is this actually a field or is this a disparate set of practices? And I actually would put something else in that question, which was, or is this like neither one of those things? Is this more of and this is coming from, by the way, a conversation I had with my colleague while you were talking, is this coming from more of a political strategy as opposed to anything else? So, I was at the NEA or right when creative placemaking, Rocco Landisman announced the strategy for creative placemaking in our town. And I see Anna Markuson is on the call too, so she obviously has a lot to say about that. So for me, at least, the perception of creative placemaking from the NEA's perspective was that this was a vessel for everything else that they wanted to do in a way to legitimize the activities of the arts sector and the NEA to all of those other non-arts related entities. And from that time period, a lot of other things happened too, where the NEA started to create all of these interagency partnerships, which they continue to do now. So for me, creative placemaking, for me, it wasn't so much about it being a field or not. And I know there's been a lot of now, literature on best practices of creative placemaking, how to do it well, what your goals are, but it seems to me like it's this overall umbrella term for what other things we want to accomplish. And this is more political than anything else.
Well, I think that's a great comment, Johanna. And, I think originally this idea of giving arts a seat at the table, at the federal level, is something that is an animating question or an animating concern of Rocco Landisman and the folks that were the architects of creative placemaking. I think the question is, where does that leave practitioners who may be far removed from political strategy, but are interested in improving the place-based characteristics of their home place and of their communities? And so when it comes to thinking about it as a field or something that persists, we have to figure out how to institutionalize some of these objectives so that they can be kind of broadly distributed in the field and among practitioners, so that it's not just necessarily at the whim of the multi-level governance strategy that comes out of the federal government. That being said, I was talking to my dean, Jason Schubach, the other day about the National Arts Summit that happened, and he said having the Surgeon General on the stage with the head of the NEA talking about how the arts can overcome the crisis of loneliness and help us with some of the challenges of democracy is very, very important. And some of the other interagency partnerships that are happening there are going to strengthen and trickle down, right, all the way to the local level. So I think it's just a question of like, it's the pragmatist question of to what purpose is it a field? It's for me not a theoretical question of whether or not we care if it's a field or not. It's a question of how can it support the work of artists and placemakers and placekeepers.
Well, and I think it's a demonstration too of how policy actually gets done and implemented, right? We all wish that policy was more evidence-based. And I think mostly what policy is it's political strategies, and what ends up getting implemented is not necessarily based on what we think should happen, but based on what was done. And then we test it, we experiment, and we change. So I just, maybe so looking into the literature that you're using and the frameworks, I think just policy process and in policy implementation is part of that. Sort of how did this even get to the point of practitioners looking for best practices for how to achieve these goals? That was created, in my opinion, from this strategy or this political strategy from the get-go. Tom Borup has a great question in the chat that I want to highlight. He says, I'm glad you started with power and agency as core. Can you say more about the core values of creative placemaking that you came across? I've seen the term used and misused as a quote unquote brand. Can you point to a set of values that drive the work?
Yeah, that's a great question or a great comment, Tom. I think there's been a lot of ink spilled on the transformation of creative placemaking over the time 2010 to 2020, from initially focusing, and maybe this is misplaced, but initially focusing on economic vibrancy and vitality and economic development, perhaps at the omission of equity, although I think that's overdetermined. I think that's saying it too clearly or too not quite right. But I think the emphasis and embrace of equity and justice as core values of creative placemaking have become definitional. And that's why I think we've seen that focus shift when I talk to practitioners, where they use the term placekeeping and place knowing, and they talk a lot about the preservation of residence in place, the infusion of arts into places where arts have already always been present, but are now being supported at a higher level. And so if I had to sort of define or divine a few key components of creative placemaking, I would say it's the focus on equity, it's artist agency, it's cross-sector work, and it's place-based. Those are the characteristics that I think stand to be to be stood up for creative placemaking. And with a lot of the branding of it and some of the practice of it, and Tom, you would know this better than anybody, some of that justice orientation or that equity orientation can sometimes be dropped off or forgotten about in the race to sort of make a place competitive or drive economic impact around making places successful in a conventional economic development sense rather than in a kind of sustained community-driven, resident-driven sense. And so, that's the value that I want to uphold, and that's the value that I want to push in the creative placemaking conversation, and really embrace that notion of self-determination by residents and communication with relevant policymakers, funders, and other stakeholders to make sure that equity and justice agenda isn't lost.
I also want to point to Carol's comment in the chat, and I maybe even make it in the form of a question, which is, she says, I think it would be worthwhile to explicitly foreground the connections between creative placemaking and cultural policy. This might help in discipline building and in the work of mapping and unfolding work, such as work on individual artist support. What I see here are new forms of expression of local cultural policy making. Wondering your response to that comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just taking notes as we talk since I'm alone here. Um, but I think I've seen that, I don't have the scope of some of the practitioners on this call, but in the Pennsylvania Creative Communities program, it very much was, I was helping to draft those guidelines along with my colleague there. And Sarah Merritt, and the notion of a place-based cultural policy intervention at the state level that focused on local communities within Pennsylvania was very much a cultural policy move that they had to advocate for at the state appropriation level, and for the state arts agency to have the capacity to deliver on creative placemaking at the community level. And it's a very well thought out and very intentional program that's still finding its way. It's only in its third iteration or something like that. But it has successfully lobbied for the imbrication of creative placemaking and cultural policy to get arts a seat at that table at the state level in Pennsylvania. And I know other things are happening around the country, which we talk a little bit about in our paper. So yes, definitely cultural policy and creative placemaking formation. I think that ties back to your comment too, Johanna, about really bringing these literatures and these thoughts together and stringing them along.
Please do ask questions. Place your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand or unmute yourself. We're all friendly here, and we love to hear from you. I wanted to ask just one question about the purpose of ArtPlace and Kresge and the organizations that really did this big push right in the beginning, and the NEA in creative placemaking. And what I saw another purpose was this idea of embedding this idea of creative placemaking so that it kind of never went away, right? And so right now we don't have those organizations pushing as hard. Maybe we do with the NEA, but Kresge has sort of shifted its focus. ArtPlace no longer exists. But I wonder, just talking to all of the folks that you've spoken to, reflecting on the field, like, did that ultimate purpose of embedding this term, maybe this practice, was that ultimately achieved from this big push that happened in the beginning?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a both and. I would say it doesn't seem that from our interviews that the term has been institutionalized broadly, although I think there are still practitioners at the local level and elected officials who are, and funders too, who are using it. But I think for the folks that were leading the charge for creative placemaking, folks who were associated with ArtPlace, Kresge, NEA, other folks that we interviewed, it's not the term that survives, it's the ethos and it's the practices that survive. And that maybe that's how we define success, that the embedding process in other, whether it's Transportation for America or the EPA or the US Water Alliance or individual artist practices, is really what matters. I'll share that I'm part of an effort in West Philadelphia called the Writers' Room Second Story Collective, which is an effort to do home sharing in 18 affordable housing units with seniors and college students living together. And the thing that brings them together to live together is the arts. They are a community of writers that have been writing and doing creative work together for a decade. And now they realize that what's keeping them apart is the affordable housing gap and the gentrification of the university's adjacent neighborhoods. And that through creative placemaking, they can work with a developer and work with tax credits and other incentives to build these 18 units of affordable housing as a pilot program to try to bridge this affordability and place keeping gap. And they very much see this work as creative placemaking, but they just don't call it that. So it certainly is moving forward. They got a grant from AmeriCorps, they got money from the National Science Foundation, they have money from a number of different partners, and they're moving forward with the developer, probably most importantly of all, to build houses. And so for them, this is creative placemaking in action, but it's embedded in their practice without being called creative placemaking.
Yeah, I see. We have three great questions now in the chat, and I'll start with Veronica. And she asks, how do you think we can continue to place, keep, and develop arts communities in an equitable way in places that have been or are going through gentrification and are slowly eradicating local communities in favor of corporate interests?
Yeah, that is the question, right? I mean, like this is we have a national housing crisis. We have an affordability crisis. We have an income inequality crisis. We have crises that pile upon crises. And figuring out how we can, as people who care about cultural policy, the arts, the humanities, have to have a role in addressing this. And I think I would go back to we had a wonderful interview with the artist Juan William Chavez, who talked about his work in Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis and the work around creating a bee sanctuary and beekeeping on the site of the former public housing towers, where they have now turned to meadow and have become rewilded. And he was talking about the importance of having, through his workshop and his nonprofit, a kind of resident-led and resident-driven approach to cultural change that really thinks about voice, power, and agency, the things that I was talking about in the presentation. We need a redistribution of those goods or those energies into the hands of people who are closest to the problem and closest to being affected. And we need partnership between those folks and persuadable entities at government, philanthropic sector, and the development sector. And I'll go back to Writers' Room to just say, this developer, Charles Lomax, who's working on the affordable housing, already had plans for development on the site where he's developing this community-centered creative placekeeping effort. But he encountered this group of artists and ragtag writers and people who care about culture and placekeeping. And he said, I am an expert in finding the funding for affordable housing. You're an expert on this model of home sharing, or you're becoming experts on this model of home sharing and kind of community building. And that would never have happened without the arts. It was the arts that preceded the community building. It was the arts that made the community building possible. It was the photography and writing that made that affordable housing project animate and become attractive to the funders that supported it. So while I don't think it's a panacea for our manifold crises, I do think an arts-informed, resident-driven, stakeholder-led redistribution and recognition of power and dynamics of agency is warranted.
Great. So you do officially, I think, win the number of most participants, because we have a class here with 10 undergrads, a class on philanthropy in the arts, and they're just logged in through one Zoom profile. So we have a question from them. Isn't that great? So we have a question from Winston in the class, and he says, as the EPA and other government agencies become more involved in creative placemaking, especially since the field was given a definition in 2010, where will creative placemaking be in 5 to 10 years? I will note too, just for this class, there's a great paper written by Ann Markison on Creative Cities, a 10-year research agenda in the Journal of Urban Affairs that talks about research on creative cities related to your question. But Andrew, I'll let you answer that question now.
Well, I think it's a question that, it's impossible to tell the future, right? But I think there's a question that has to be asked around whether or not there is a convening entity that brings together creative placemaking or what have you practitioners to continue to offer support and mutual aid to each other, I think, in order to increase the viability of this, whether we're calling it a field or a political strategy or a set of practices. I think in the next 5 years, there needs to be coordination and connection in order to kind of bring the stakeholders together. Johanna is not here to brag on her own behalf, but the work that Care Lab is doing, the artists in residence and government work, I think coordinates and brings together folks in important ways. And I think that coordination and connection is where I'd like to see it go in the next 5 years, so that we can kind of offer each other those dynamics of support and agency that will enhance the practice of placemaking and placekeeping.
The Carol then kind of follows up on her cultural policy question comment. And again, like I want to pose this in the form of a question, but she really does stress this idea that, it's important to loop this work into cultural policy, because otherwise that discourse turns into something abstract or tied to economic impacts or an aid of gentrifying development, et cetera. And so just maybe you can respond to that sentiment there.
Well, I just want to say that I agree, and I think I should follow up with Carol about this as someone who has so much experience and capacity to share around cultural policy. But I do think that it's important that the work not be co-opted by a development agenda or by an agenda. I see there was something in the comment about Republicans and Democrats, and I don't know that I need to necessarily go there, but I think that there is definitely like a progressive impulse or a sort of an impulse towards justice and equity that needs to be part of a cultural policy conversation in this country broadly, whether it be from the movement for Black Lives or other justice-oriented activities that have taken place since 2019 and 2020, when we started looking at the financing creative placemaking report. We've only seen sort of emergence, backlash on all these justice movements, and we need to kind of like continue to push that rock up the hill and make sure that there's not that co-optation of these very real successes in communities that I think we've seen from creative placemaking, and we want to sort of see those continue. So Carol, I will follow up with you on the point of cultural policy.
And then there's kind of a two-part question. So, I know you said you weren't going to go there, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Yeah.
So is this a partisan issue? And then, if and can you provide, for example, some examples on how different policy approaches toward creative placemaking maybe differs across partisan lines? And maybe you can do that by, I don't know if you want to do that or not. However, you also sort of did share some policy recommendations. Could you reshare those
Yeah, I
policy
can go back to
recommendations?
those. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. And then maybe talk about like how you came up with that list. Like, were these your conclusions? Were these what informants recommended?
Yeah, these were coming out of the interviews, and they were supported by our data gathering and kind of derived from our conversations with them. Let me see if I can pull up the slide. I think I need to reshare. You would think by now my Zoom skills would be like incredible, but they're still in development. So, the first one was to empower some entity to organize the future of cross-sector field building, right? So there was a definite desire from the folks that we met with that there be some coordinating entity. Valuing artist labor is critical. Educating artists and community development about the power of this work, and funding racial justice and solidarity economy work. Now, we've all had conversations about the persistence of the federal funding and state funding for the arts across different kinds of administrations, despite the attempts of some to zero out funding for cultural practices and for arts and humanities. And I think that will hopefully continue. I mean, like the notion that we have a robust infrastructure, well, maybe robust is too strong a word, but an infrastructure in place in the United States to support publicly funded arts and culture. And this makes me think back to Michael Rushton's talk a few months ago about the various, causes and justifications for that public support. But I think a lot of this stuff can be bipartisan in the sense that the notion of community development and community improvement is something that a lot of people can agree on when they're brought together in stakeholder work. And I think of, cross community work, like work that's done at Apple Shop, or work that I've seen done through the Story Circles method or through Theater of the Oppressed, and arts-based practices that bring people together across difference and help them see the benefit of driving towards mutually satisfactory places that are not, I don't think anyone wants to see places that are governed by, big business and are not community driven. But I think we sometimes get lost in the equation when we don't bring it down to the level of the local practitioner, the local artist, the local citizen, and we sort of don't persuade the folks that we need to work together collectively to persuade. I do think funding racial justice and solidarity economy work is a tall order in the political climate that we're in now, as we've seen the retrenchment in everything from higher ed to to hiring to other and parts of our society. So I think we just need to keep pushing on that. There's a lot of important work being done, and there's a lot of work still to do to make sure that these agendas don't get lost in the sort of the polarization of the moment. And I'll put in a plug for the book that Tom and I are working on now. It's called Democracy as Creative Practice, Weaving a Culture of Civic Life. And it's supposed to be out in the third quarter, fourth quarter of this year. And it's a collection of essays by artists around the world and creative practitioners who are working to try to address the shortcomings and the fragility of democracy. And so we'll share more with you as that comes closer to publication. So
Well,
I'll stop my share.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. We're going to have to end now, but thank you all for all of your comments, your questions. This could have been an ongoing, very intriguing discussion. We could have gone on forever. But thank you, Andrew. Please give our best to Johanna as well. We know that a lot of work went into this presentation and all of this work, and obviously there's somebody who's not represented here.
Yeah, I will give her a call right after and see how she's feeling and make sure everything's okay. And I will give her everyone's best.
Thank you. And please do join us again next week. I will be interviewed apparently by my colleague here, Michael Rushton, on a book I have forthcoming called Being an Artist in America, How Artists Build Careers and What Society Can Do to Support Them. And I'm super excited to talk about the work in the book, given that I don't think anyone else has read it but me. So happy to hopefully see all of you. All right. Thanks
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.